The 2009 MLB draft was a historic moment for Major League Baseball. For one thing, it was the first draft that was going to be televised on the newly established MLB network, and as such, Major League Baseball made sure to pull out all the stops. The network had wall-to-wall coverage of the draft. Studio 42 was converted into a draft day ballroom filled with executives, and they invited every potential first-round pick to join them in New Jersey for the celebration. But there was just one issue. No one took them up on their offer. Even Steven Strasburg, who was undoubtedly going to be the number one pick, declined to come to Secaucus to join in the festivities. In fact, for all the invitations that they sent out, they were only able to get one person to come to the draft. A high school kid from just down the road in Millville, New Jersey. A kid by the name of Michael Nelson Trout. By now, you've probably already heard the story. Trout came into the draft as one of the most heralded high school prospects in the country, but due to the strong draft class around him, as well as some questions about how well he'd adapt to the next level, he fell to the 25th pick, where he was taken by the Angels and became the greatest player of his generation. But what you might not know is that if it weren't for one rainy day earlier that year, Trout very well could have gone 10 picks earlier and established his career in the desert with the Arizona Diamondbacks. This is the story of how the Angels landed Mike Trout. This is Sports Oddity. The year was 2009, and the Diamondbacks were in a pretty good spot. Their rotation was headed up by star pitcher Dan Herron and Cy Young winner Brandon Webb, and on the way was a 23-year-old right-hander by the name of Max Scherzer. On the field, they had a pretty decent surrounding cast, with players like Stephen Drew, Connor Jackson, Orlando Hudson, and a 20-year-old phenom by the name of Justin Upton. This was a team just 2 years removed from an NLCS appearance, and looking at the talent on the roster, you got the impression heading into the year that this was a team that just needed a couple more pieces to really make something special, which put a lot of pressure on the front office for the 2009 draft. After trading away Orlando Hudson, they found themselves with back-to-back picks in the first round at 16 and 17. And they had a pretty clear idea of how they were going to use them. The first was going to be used to draft a high school player with a good amount of upside, a guy that they can develop into a top-tier player. The second was going to be used to draft a college player, someone with more experience at higher levels that could theoretically get to the show sooner rather than later. For the college pick, the Diamondbacks set their sights on outfielder A.J. Pollock, who made quite a name for himself during his tenure with Notre Dame. The high school pick was a little bit more up in the air, but there was a guy that a lot of people in the draft room really seemed to like, that being Mike Trout. After all, he had received glowing reviews for his tool set from some of the scouts in the area, and one of their other pro scouts was an alumnus of Millville High, where Trout was playing at the time and was familiar with the program they ran there. In other words, they knew Trout better than just about any other team in the league, and it was very likely that he was going to be the guy come draft day. So how did all this fall through? Well, that's an interesting story. It was May of 2009, just about a month before the first-year player draft, and the Diamondbacks were frantically trying to get their last-minute evaluations in. On that fateful day, Diamondback scout Tom Allison was not in Millville, but rather in Long Island. There, he was supposed to be seeing a young pitching prospect, a guy by the name of Steven Matz. But there was just one issue. Earlier that day, it started to rain, and unfortunately, it never let up, leading to the cancellation of Matz's game. Not wanting to lose a valuable day of scouting right before the draft, Allison checked the schedules of the other teams in the area to see if any of the other potential draft picks they were following were playing that day. Fortunately for him, it looked like Mike Trout was playing in Millville, so he packed up his car and drove down to New Jersey to go watch the kid play. This was going to be his second time watching Trout in person. The first came earlier that spring, and it also came with a glowing review from Allison. As he remarked in an article published last year about this story, he remarked, "I'm way in on the athlete, way in on the run, and he's got some power." However, it's also important to point out that at this point, there were also a lot of question marks associated with Trout's abilities. Typically, high school players in the Northeast come with a lot of additional risks for scouts like Allison. For one thing, their winters are so cold and start so early that they rarely ever play fall or winter ball like a lot of teams in the South do. Additionally, because their winter ends so late, their seasons start much later than other high schools, and they also have much shorter seasons due to the constraint of the school year. Because of this, scouts have to try and figure out the true talent level of a player based on a very small sample size of performances that typically come against subpar pitching, and Trout was no exception to this rule. However, at that time, Allison and the D-backs were more than willing to take that risk based on Trout's amazing athleticism alone. Unfortunately for Trout though, what Allison would witness on that fateful game was a very rare sight in baseball. That being a terrible game from Mike Trout. There aren't a whole lot of accounts of this game that are around, but needless to say, he looked bad. Bad enough to put all of the doubts and questions and trepidations back into Allison's mind about Trout. Bad enough to make the Diamondbacks completely out on drafting him in the first round. 1 month later, the Diamondbacks would officially pass on Trout in favor of a high school third baseman from Florida named Bobby Borschering, a kid that would never end up suiting up for the Diamondbacks in a major league game. That being said, the 2009 draft was far from a bust for the Arizona Diamondbacks. A.J. Pollock was every bit the player that they thought he would be, and he eventually became an all-star. Meanwhile, in the 8th round of the draft, they still managed to find their face of the franchise player in first baseman Paul Goldschmidt. But with hindsight being 2020, one can only imagine how different the Diamondbacks' fortunes might have been this decade had a certain game not been rained out in Long Island and Mike Trout went to the Snakes. However, this is not meant to be a dig at Allison or anybody else in the Diamondbacks front office. After all, they're far from the only ones that missed out on Trout. If anything, this story is a testament to just how difficult the art of scouting is, and how just one wrong move, how one cruel twist of fate can make or break your draft and change the entire direction of your organization. On that fateful day in June of 2009, 22 organizations would learn this lesson the hard way, and the game would change forever as a result. Thank you for watching this episode of Sports Oddity. If you liked what you saw, be sure to like this video and subscribe down below if you're new. Also, if you're in the mood for more baseball content, be sure to check us out on our website, readthediamond.com, and follow us on social media at TheDiamondUS on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.